welcome to podcast.init. We're recording today on May 17th, 2015. Your hosts, as usual, are Tobias Macy and Chris Patty. You can follow us on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. You can also find our RSS feed on our site at podcastinit.com. And please give us feedback. You can leave reviews on iTunes, contact us by Twitter, email us at hosts@podcastinit.com, or leave us comments on our show notes. Today we're going to be interviewing Jonathan Slenders. So, Jonathan, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Jonathan. I'm a Python developer. I did quite a lot of open source projects. Currently, I work for Cisco mainly as a Python coach and a Python trainer. Yeah, I think that's about it.
How were you first introduced to Python?
Okay, that should be already a long time ago. I'm not entirely sure, but I guess between 10, maybe 15 years ago that I started playing with it. And I don't remember what I did exactly, but I think then I dropped Python for a while. I started experimenting with a few other languages. And then later I started using Python again. I think it should have been about 7 years ago that I started Python for a bit more serious work. And then I created Python web application stack, a bit similar to Django, so a templating engine, an HTTP layer, etc. But I dropped that project. We have now Django, which is much better. But I learned about a lot by doing that. And from then on, I've been using Django for all my projects. But I'm not entirely sure. So when exactly I started and what the reason was. But I'm actually happy that I chose Python in the end.
What inspired you to create the Python prompt toolkit?
Okay, yeah, that's also a long history. It should have been a few years ago that I was working on Tmux. So, do you know Tmux? It's a terminal multiplexer.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, so I was working on a few patches for Tmux and to add like pane title bars so that each pane in Tmux would have its own title bar with a description of the process running inside it, with maybe some statistics and other things. And it was quite a lot of effort, but in the end I got there, but I had a hard time getting this merged into the upstream Tmux, because Tmux runs on so many different platforms. It's expected to be really stable, so in order to add some new functionality, it should be really tested. And at that time, I did not have the energy, and I did not want to do the effort to test all my patches everywhere. And that was about the same time that Async.io for Python was developed. It was still, I think, in the alpha phase. And I started developing a Tmux clone in Python using Async.io for all the process synchronization, and that worked pretty well. I had things like vertical splits, horizontal splits, a nice few other things. But then at some point, I needed to have a command line. So at the bottom of Tmux, you have a command line where you can enter commands to do things with Tmux. And the most obvious way, of course, to do that was to use the readline library for Python and to use the bindings for that. But there was one issue, and it is that the readline bindings of Python, they have some assumptions about what the input and output is. And Tmux actually has a client-server architecture, so the user interface actually runs in another process than the Tmux session itself. And it was similar for my Python clone of Tmux. So I could not really use the readline bindings. And that was the point where I started implementing readline in pure Python. And that was the start of prompt toolkits. That developed a lot, that went through several iterations. And in the end, actually, I dropped the Demons project because Prompt Toolkit, it was so exciting. I got to develop quite a lot of other things. So that's a bit of the history.
Very cool. I was actually going to ask you as my next question. You've already kind of answered this, though. What prompted you to create the Prompt Toolkit when more traditional tools were already available? You've already gone over that. So, what were some of the design considerations that you made when building the Prompt Toolkit?
Maybe a few. I think one thing that's really present in the whole library is that I try not to use too much of inheritance. And we could start talking about a shared state between parent and child objects, which is like a very strong kind of coupling. But another reason for me not to use too much inheritance is I think that inheritance is not like a really nice API to expose as a library. So if you want your users to use your library and you expect them to inherit from your classes and to add functionality to it, it's not really that obvious which things are considered private, which things are public, and which things are actually intended to be customizable. And on the other hand, if you expose callables either as functions or constructors of classes as an API, I think that's a much nicer way, because then for a function, it's really clear what the input is. The inputs are the parameters of a function. So if you want to parameterize one piece of functionality, I think it's really nice to do that just as a function, or in case when it's a class, to use the constructor for that instead of expecting someone to use inheritance for parameterization. And I think that's something that many Python projects, how I feel personally, are not always doing it the easiest way for the end user. So in Python, it's really easy to use inheritance. It's an obvious way to parameterize things, like you have the base behavior, you inherit from it, you implement the changes in the child class. But another way to do that is to use the constructor of a class to accept all the parameters of that class and expect the end user just to create an instance of that. So that's one of the design considerations I made, and I think that's what makes, in this particular case, a nice, clean API. Maybe another thing is that Prompt Toolkit, it's completely event-driven. So there are a few things which are asynchronous, like the autocompletion is completely asynchronous in PT Python, so the Python REPL implemented on top of the library. When the doc strings are shown, or when the function signature is shown, these are also things which are asynchronous. And they are obviously done through threading, but the interaction between the main threads and the threads doing the autocompletion, it's all going through an event loop. And that makes it really easy or safe to do interaction between several threads to avoid things like race conditions, etc. So that way there's no need to do any kind of locking. And maybe one last design consideration that I had through the whole library is that there's no single global state. So for every single component in the whole library, it's possible to create multiple instances. And maybe that sounds weird for line replacement, because normally you only have like one input. But I think in the future it should also be possible to use like maybe an SSH server or a telnet server, which runs in one process. And every time when a client connects to the server, they should be able to view one such interface. So that's the reason for not having a global state. And it's also something that I was missing in the rate line bindings. The rate line bindings of Python, they have a really strong opinion about what is input and output. It's just std in and std out. And so it's impossible to have multiple rate line instances in Python. But in Prompt Toolkit, that's possible.
That's really interesting. It almost makes me think of, with regards to your, whole point about minimizing the use of inheritance. I forget whether it was Gang of Four, or I know I've seen it in a bunch of places where they will always say favor composition over inheritance. And,
yeah, exactly.
Talk about how people in object-oriented programming languages, it's like inheritance is the shiny toy, and they feel like they really want to use it, and they end up overusing it and end up really complicating their designs unnecessarily. It seems like this might be a really excellent example of how you've avoided that.
Yeah, maybe. And one thing which is nice in Python, that is that you have abstract base classes. So Python encourages shallow inheritance. And I think just one layer of inheritance is okay. So you have your base class, which is an abstract base class, which does not have a real implementation, but just specifies the interface of a thing. So in Prompt Toolkit, for instance, you have like an autocompleter interface. So if you want to write an autocompletion algorithm and you want to plug it in the library, you just implement that interface, and you do it by inheriting from the abstract base class, which defines the interface for an autocompletion. But that base class does not have any single implementation. It just specifies the expected behavior of that class. And I think that's a nice way to do it in Python.
And actually, can you go back and just explain for me a little bit? I know what led into this asynchrony discussion was you talking about PT-Python and how it uses asynchrony. And I know you mentioned something about the doc strings, but I mean, it's a REPL, right? Like, why does an interactive REPL like that, how does it benefit from having an asynchronous prompt library under the hood? And if you already explained that previously, I apologize, but it seems like there might be some interesting tidbits there.
Yeah, maybe for the docstring, it was not really necessary to do it asynchronously, but for the autocompletion, in any case, it was, because the autocompletion, it can be really heavy. Python is an extremely dynamic language, and if you want to do autocompletion of source code without executing anything, so you don't want to do a lookup of the attributes of an object, because doing a lookup could have possibly side effects. So autocompletion, it's done through analyzing the source code, and I'm using an amazing library for that. It's Jedi, and Jedi works by analyzing the source code, and it's not like really slow, but slow enough to not do it on every single key press. And so you want the user to be able to type while we do the autocompletion in the background without the user noticing it. And actually, that's the only reason, because just the Jedi library is slightly too slow to do it in real time on every single key press.
That is really neat. So basically, I'm typing along, and let's say I say double quotes hello world dot. So now I've created a string, and I want to get the completion for all the potential methods that come off that string. How does that? Can you give me a sense of how that is working asynchronously? So you're saying Jedi is too slow to check with every keystroke. What happens when I hit that dot? How does the asynchrony kick in and enable Jedi to be fast enough to make the user feel like it's kind of a real-time response?
So on every single key press, actually, I start the autocompletion in another thread. But as soon as there is already an autocompletion going on, I don't restart an autocompletion on the next key press. So that way there's always one autocompletion running in the background. And when it comes back and it sees that the input has not changed, it knows that the autocompletion is the one that applies to the current input. So if you go on and you type too fast, for a while the autocompletion running in the background will do the autocompletion of a few keys throws back, but we just ignored it. And then in the end, when there's a small pause and maybe that one has finished, we restart the autocompletion so that we always have the latest autocompletions available.
That's a really smart way of doing it. So you basically have found kind of the perfect match between giving real time, sort of like I'm typing and it's guessing what I'm going to be typing next, and you've actually finished and you're sitting there, thinking about it or whatever, and it's now actually going to give you the correct completion for the class that you've actually typed. So you get the full completion of exactly what you want. That's a really great design, it sounds like.
Yes, that's more or less how it works indeed.
So you've built a number of projects that use the prompt toolkit as the core component. And did you have those in mind from the beginning of working on the library, or are they primarily used as experiments to test the capabilities of the toolkit and some of the things that you can do with it and maybe find edge cases that need to be addressed?
So actually I had none of them in mind when I started Prompt Toolkit, because actually Prompt Toolkit, it was a tool that I wanted to use for my Tmux clone in Python, which actually I abandoned. So all of the other projects that I built on top of it, they were just things that came into my mind later on. And PT Python, the Python REPL, was obviously the most obvious thing to do with such a library. So that was the first thing that I did. And then a few other projects came just out of interest and to test the capabilities.
And can you elaborate on what some of those other projects were and some of the inspirations behind them? I know you did the PGCLI and PyVim, which are both definitely very interesting in their own right. So just wondering if you can give a little bit more insight into what inspired you to create them and what benefits you had from using them now that they've been
PGCLI was not created by me.
Okay.
It's actually a friend. It is Amjad. And I had a lot of correspondence with him while building PT Python, or Prompt Toolkit, I mean. And I got a lot of feedback from him, and he was like my first test user, even before it was public. And I think at some point he got interested in using the library, and he decided to create PGCLI, so a Postgres REPL for that library to test it. And now he's working on a MySQL client. He got a Kickstarter campaign funded with a few $1,000, so that was really nice. And hopefully we'll see a MySQL client soon. But yeah, I created PT Python. Later I created PT BDB. So Python debugger like BDB, but then using the PT Python front end with the nice autocompletion, etc. That's still a highly experimental project. It needs to get a bit more love, but we will get there. I have a working proof of concept, and I will probably improve it somewhere during the next months. And then we have PyVim. And that came actually after a question of my talk at Python FOSDEM. So a few months ago, I had the chance to speak at FOSDEM. It's a Belgian open source conference. And one of the questions from the audience was that someone asking me, if you have all these capabilities like Prompt Toolkit, it has very nice key binding system. It has a very nice layout engine. It has a very nice rendering engine and a few other things. And he said, well, if you have already all these capabilities, how far are you actually from a real editor? And then I started experimenting with it. And actually it was not that much of an effort. And after a few months, just in my free time, I had PyVim as a proof of concept, which is now really usable. I use it actually as my primary editor just to test the capabilities and to get confronted with its limitations. It's not yet like a real VI replacement, but it's nice.
that actually brings us into our next question. We had actually thought to ask you, do you intend to keep evolving PyVim and eventually make it into something that really could be in feature parity or close with Vim, or is it just kind of an experimental test bed for you to show how the prompt toolkit can be used in an actual application?
Yeah, actually, I don't know yet. We will see, but Vim is really a real complex application. It has so many capabilities which are not visible at the first looks. There are so many hidden features. So I think I will never be in parity with the real Vim, and I think NeoVim may be a better candidate for people looking for a real replacement. But I think what I will do with PyVim is I want to have something that is easy to install and that feels natural to VI users, and which has at the same time a good Python integration, like syntax highlighting, auto-completion, and the things that you need for Python development. Maybe at some point even a debugger. But I will see. I don't know yet.
So going back to the PT Python, how difficult was it to integrate it with IPython, and what benefits did you see from doing that integration?
The benefits are that IPython has a lot of additional functionality, like there are the built-in magics. For instance, if you do the person sign PDB space on, you can automatically call the PDB prompt when an error happens. And IPython has many more such nice built-ins. Also, I really like the percent time it if you want to benchmark a small piece of code. And I did not really see PT Python as a replacement for IPython, but I wanted to be able to use it actually as a nicer front end for IPython, and that was when I created PT IPython. But the integration itself, it was not that hard. It's not the nicest way I did it. It's maybe still kind of a hack to the way I did the integration, but it works really well. Except for one thing, and that is that IPython has its own event loop. For instance, if you want to show a graph, like for instance with NumPy or SciPy, it's possible to plot a graph, or maybe Matplotlib, I think it is. And then IPython can show the graph at the same time when you run the REPL. And IPython does it by using its own event loop and by patching the input stream. And given that Prompt Toolkit has its own event loop, I was not yet able to integrate both event loops. So PT IPython uses the event loop of Prompt Toolkit, and it does not run the event loop of IPython, which makes it impossible to run or to show windows for plots. And that's still something I have to do to find a better way to do that integration.
Well, that was actually something that I was going to ask you is, have you ever considered I think PT Python is amazing and IPython is amazing. It sounds like, to quote an American commercial, two great tastes that would taste great together. Have you ever thought about talking to the IPython team and maybe building some of the awesome PT Python interactive completion features into IPython core?
Yeah, I've indeed talked with some of the IPython core developers. But right now that the integration is maybe a bit idle. We have both been busy, I think, with other things. I've been busy lately much more at improving prompt toolkits and experimenting with PyVim and looking for an even better architecture of prompt toolkits. So the integration was maybe a bit on the pause, but yeah, we will see. We will figure it out probably to find a better way.
So what are some of the most interesting uses that you've seen for Prompt Toolkit?
Yeah, I think PyVim itself probably was the the application where I really went to the limits. So that was the application where I really challenged the design. Otherwise, I think the Peaches CLI and the upcoming MySQL CLI will be really nice. And one other nice thing is lately a friend of me, he's developing a lot using async.io in Python. And one thing for debugging an async.io process, it's sometimes still hard to debug an async.io process because you don't want to have any blocking calls in it. So you don't want to have a REPL inside the async.io process because then everything halts if you're doing that. And what he is doing, he is using an SSH server which runs inside the process, which listens on a local socket, and he connects just using an SSH client to that socket to control and debug the async.io process. And the thing he asked me was, isn't it possible to use the PT Python REPL and run that through the SSH server? And I'm going to have a look at that because I think that's really exciting. If you have an async.io process and then you SSH to a local Unix socket and you get a Python REPL to control another process, a Python process, which just goes on running. So the REPL does not cause the process to block. I think that's exciting.
That is really exciting. Does your friend's project have a name? Is it something we can sort of watch out for?
No, it's a commercial project that he's working on, but the SSH server is open source, and I will probably try to integrate with these SSH server.
Well, so are there any other projects? We've obviously been talking about Prompt Toolkit and things like that and all the spin-off projects. Are there any other projects that you're working on that you think might be interesting to our listeners?
Maybe not necessarily interesting, but one thing I've been working on several years ago was a Python deployment framework. It is like Fabric, but a bit more advanced, but still not yet like SaltStack or Ansible or other Python frameworks that we have. And we use that to deploy quite a lot of Linux Ubuntu machines. But I think maybe right now SaltStack could be a better choice. And I don't have the time anymore to work a lot on that one.
Yeah, I do infrastructure as code work all day long, and I have to say sometimes the community around the tool is actually more important than the tool itself. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, my current company uses Chef, and I happen to like Chef, and I think one of the things that makes Chef great in my mind anyway is the incredible ecosystem of cookbooks and recipes that are around it. And I know the same thing is starting to happen with both Ansible and Salt. So, you know, sometimes even if yours is better, it's like it probably makes sense to use the one that has the momentum in the industry.
Yeah, exactly. If you can write the best tool, but if you don't have the people or the knowledge to or the time to support all those people, you won't get anywhere. So it's really important to have a good community. And that's also why I'm now focusing more on Prompt Toolkit, because I really feel that was a gap where we did not have a solution yet, and which was something I liked, and so I prefer to spend my time on that instead.
Makes good sense. Are there any questions that you feel like we should have asked you but didn't? Something that you think that that you'd like to tell us or tell our listeners?
No, I think you are doing a great job, and it's really nice to have a Python podcast. And I look forward also to the next interviews.
Thank you. It's kind of funny that for a long time there were none, and then all of a sudden we had this idea, and then the other gentleman who does Talk Python to me, he came out in the exact same week. So it's like we went from none to two in no time flat. But thankfully the Python community is huge, so there's plenty of room for both of us to thrive. So why don't we move on to the picks? This is where we have our guests as well as us go through things that we find interesting, neat, fun, tasty, whatever, things that we want to recommend to our users or that we think they might be interested in. So Tobias, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. So my first pick that I'm going to go with this week is a project called VimCert. And this is a plugin for the Chrome browser that lets you basically use a Vim process or Vim style editor in any text input. So you click on a text input, hit Control-I, and it'll pop up in an ACE editor with Vim key bindings so that you can then edit the entire contents of the text input. And then when you are done with it, you just hit :WQ, just like in a Vim process, and it is really useful. So I've actually been using it at work for managing some SQL queries that are being put in via a text input box, and it's much easier to do that than trying to manage it directly within the text input. For my next pick, I'm going to choose the Johnny Cash project, and this is a website that is a collaborative art piece, and it is a music video of one of Johnny Cash's last recordings, and people are encouraged to pick a given frame of that music video and draw it using a tool that they created. And then you can play the music video, and it is a compilation of all the different frames that people have drawn put together, and it is a really incredible experience. And you can actually choose different styles of artwork that people have done to view the video in different ways. So it's a continually evolving experience, and it's just really great fun. My third pick is going to be the movie Interstellar, and I watched that a couple weeks ago, and it was really very well done. It addresses a lot of interesting problems with how we're currently managing our natural resources and, you know, our ongoing discussion of space travel and colonization of remote worlds. And it also does a really good job of addressing the complications of relativity in space travel, particularly in how it relates to the main character's relationship with his children who he had to leave behind on Earth. So, just really great movie, definitely worth a watch. And that's it for me this week.
Great, thanks Tobias. This week I'm going to start off with a beer pick because I like beer and I like really good craft beer. I just encountered a beer that is really unusual. It is called Grimm Brewing's Telekinesis. It is a wild American ale. So I tend to be a draft beer snob. I don't often enjoy beer in bottles, at least when I can get away with it. I tend to like to go to a pub and actually enjoy it right out of the keg. I just think it's a lot fresher and a lot tastier. And this beer came to me, and it looks like fizzy yellow limoncello, you know, like for anybody who is familiar with that particular kind of lemon liqueur. So it's really interesting. It's kind of sour, kind of dry, not sweet at all, really, or very, very minimally so. Just a little bit of hoppiness. It's really interesting, I have to say. It's kind of in a category all its own. They call it a wild American ale. And if you like beer and you're open-minded, this is not like the kind of thing that if you drink Bud Light all the time, you're going to appreciate. You have to be willing to sort of recognize that the beer world is huge and varied, and this is definitely something that this is an outlier, and thus, if you're a fan as I am, it's worth checking out. My next pick is this tool called Pandoc. It's an open source project, and the idea is that it will convert documents of kind of any, I shouldn't say any, of many, many different formats to many, many other different kind of formats. And I started using it because we do our show notes every week in Zoho Docs, which we've previously picked, because we can be collaborative about it and we're literally typing back and forth. But at the end, you know, we want to transition the picks and everything else and the questions we've asked to our show notes website. And Zoho Docs will export a Microsoft, .docx XML format document, and then Pandoc will transform it into Markdown. So with a few minor edits, I can just put it right in the show notes site, which we run with Pelican. So it's a really handy tool if you have a document of one format and you need it in another, I would definitely check it out. And the link's in the show notes. The next pick I have is one of those little tools that's kind of like, you hear about it, you try it, you say, oh, I'll give this a shot, and then it becomes kind of life-changing. It's called Vim Pager, and what this tool does is essentially it replaces your current pager, which is probably like more or less or whatever, depending upon what you have configured, and replaces it with Vim. And so the really great thing about this is you don't realize how ubiquitous, if you use Unix all the time, day in, day out, your pager is. Things like looking at looking at source code control logs, or reading man pages, or reading long log files, or whatever, and to have all the amazing text, searching, manipulation, and etc. features that Vim brings to bear. It's a really handy tool. My last pick is going to be a project, another open source project called Homebrew Cask. This is for Macs only, because the Homebrew package manager. But what's really cool is Homebrew Cask basically takes it to the next level. And as opposed to just open source project, which is mostly what Homebrew itself is, these little packages that you can download easily, Homebrew Cask lets you install fully fledged commercial applications with Homebrew, like Chrome, like, iTerm, like all the web browsers, all the mail clients, all the apps that normally you would have to download, unpack a .dmg file, which is the OS X specific application archive, and do the drag and drop thing with the icon. And what's great about this, from my perspective, is, I can write a little script, and so when I get a new machine or I walk onto a new machine, I can have it, install all my applications that I want in one fell swoop. So I find it really handy. And that's it for me. Jonathan, do you have any picks for our audience?
Actually, I forgot to choose any picks, but I think talking about beer, that was your first pick, I think. I think if you like beer, then you should certainly come someday to Belgium.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. I am a huge Belgian beer fan, and I feel like I've just explored the very tip of the iceberg. I love Belgian beers. I love the kind of subtle fruitiness of them, of some of them, and the complexity, and they're just great. It's not quite. I'm not sure if it's Belgian or not, but Duchess de Bourgogne, that's one of my favorite beers of all time, and I guess that's from the Burgundy region, which is not Belgium, right? That's like France or something like that. My geography is really terrible.
It could be. I'm not entirely sure, actually.
So, what are some of your favorite Belgian beers? If let's say our listeners get a chance to visit Belgium, what should they not miss?
I don't drink that much beer, but one of my favorites is probably Rochefort. I would recommend that one.
Okay, that sounds great. So at some point, we'll have to get the spelling of that because I'm not sure that I will get it right on the show notes. Yeah, so we can look it up and allow our listeners to find it. Is there anything else that you'd like to recommend? Any games that you play, books you've read, movies you've watched, anything?
Good question. No, lately actually I'm more like dancing a lot. In Belgium we have a nice community of people doing folk dance, and that's what I like a lot. So that's more of my free time.
No, that's fantastic, actually. So what kind of folk dancing? Morris dancing, contra dancing? Like what? Is it Belgian folk dancing? Is there a particular technique or genre that is germane to Belgium?
It's most the things we are doing are mostly coming from Western Europe, and it's still improvisation, so it's not dancing for public and more for our own fun. And we have quite a lot of different dances. We have couple dances, we have group dances, and most of them are originally from France, from maybe a bit from Belgium, from Sweden, so Western Europe.
That's great. Okay, Western European folk dancing. Sounds like fun. Okay, so I think that'll do it for the picks. Tobias, go ahead.
All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us and taking the time to speak with us so that we could talk to you about your prompt toolkit and some of the other projects that you've been involved with. So for anybody who wants to follow you and keep up to date with what you're working on, what would be the best way to do that?
I think maybe GitHub or maybe Twitter as well.
Well, thank you again, and I hope you have a good evening.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure.